Hello, we are live on day 383. We are going to be continuing our reading of A People's History of the United States. We're on Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is titled Persons of Mean and Vile Condition. Right now, so far, is mainly covered. Chapter 1 covered Columbus and different other European travelers, European colonizers that came over here, and how they it was really heavily focused on genocide. Then chapter two was hold on, the color line and early slave trade, and first going over to Africa, and early conditions on the boats and slave ships and things of that nature. So chapter 3, persons of mean and vile condition. In 1676, 70 years after Virginia was founded, 100 years before it supplied leadership for the American Revolution, that colony faced a rebellion of white frontiersmen, joined by slaves and servants. A rebellion so threatening that the governor had to flee the burning capital of Jamestown. And England decided to send 1,000 soldiers across the Atlantic, hoping to maintain order among 40,000 colonists. This was Bacon's rebellion. After the uprising was suppressed, its leader, Nathaniel Bacon, dead, and his associates hanged. Bacon was described in a Royal Commission report. He was said to be about 4 or 5 and 30 years of age. Okay, so about 35 years old. Indifferent, tall, but slender. Black-haired, and of an ominous, melancholy aspect. Of a pestilent and prevalent logical discourse, tending to asthma. I'm be honest, I ain't never seen any of these words before. Atheisms. He seduced the vulgar and the most ignorant people to believe. Two-thirds of each county being that of sort. So that their whole hearts and hopes were set upon Bacon. Next, he charges the governor as negligent and wicked, treacherous and incapable, the laws and taxes as unjust and oppressive, and cries of absolute necessities of redress. Thus Bacon encouraged the tumult, and as an unquiet crowd follow and adhere to him, he listeth them as they come in upon a large paper, writing their names circular-wise, that their ringleaders might not be found out. Having cornered them into the circle, given them brandy to wind up the charm, and enjoy them by great oath to stick fast together, and to him and the oath being administered, he went and infected New Kent County ripe for rebellion. Bacon's rebellion began with conflict over how to deal with the Indians, who were close by on the western frontier, constantly threatening. White people who had been ignored with huge land grants around Jamestown were given away, had gone west to find land, and there they encountered Indians. Were those frontier Virginians resentful that the politicos and landed aristocrats who controlled the colony's government in Jamestown first pushed them westward into Indian territory, and then seemed indecisive in fighting the Indians? That might explain the character of their rebellion, not easily classifiable as either anti-aristocrat or anti-Indian, because it was both. And the governor, William Berkeley, and his Jamestown crowd, were they more conciliatory to the Indians, they wooed certain of them as spies and allies, now that they had monopolized the land in the East, could use frontier whites as a buffer in needed space. The desperation of the government and suppressing the rebellion seemed to have a double motive: developing an Indian policy which would divide Indians in order to control them. In New England at this very time, Massasoit's son Medicon was threatening to unite Indian tribes and had done frightening damage to Puritan settlements in King Philip's War. That reminded me just of that, and hearing that Medicon was threatening to unite Indian tribes. That made me think of Fred Hampton and trying to unite different gangs in Chicago. That made me think of Martin Luther King and how national the Poor People's Campaign would be. And that made me think of the last speech that Malcolm X gave. That's what that made me think. And to think about how Medicon would end up being murdered in the similar nature to what they were. That was just all things that make me think about. Okay. And teaching the poor whites of Virginia that rebellion did not pay by a show of superior force, by calling for troops from England itself, by mass hanging. Violence had escalated on the frontier before the rebellion. Some Doeg, Doge Indians took a few hogs to redress a debt, and whites retrieving the hogs murdered 2 Indians. The Doge then sent out a war party to kill a white herdsman, after which a white militia company killed 24 Indians. This led to a series of Indian raids, with the Indians outnumbered, turning to guerrilla warfare. The House of Burgess in Jamestown declared war on the Indians, but proposed to exempt those Indians who cooperated. This seemed to anger the frontiers people, who wanted total war, but also resented the high taxes assessed to pay for the war. Times were hard in 1676. There was genuine distress. There was genuine poverty. All contemporary sources speak of the great mass of people as living in severe economic straits, writes Wilcom Washburn. Wilcom Washburn, who, using British colonial records, has done an exhaustive study of Bacon's rebellion. It was a dry summer, ruining the corn crop, which was needed for food, and the tobacco crop needed for export. Governor Berkeley, in his 70s, tired of holding office, wrote rarely about his situation. How miserable that man is that governs a people where 6 parts of 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. His phrase, 6 parts of 7, suggests the existence of an upper class not so impoverished. In fact, there was such a class already developed in Virginia. Bacon himself came from this class, had a good bit of land, and was probably more enthusiastic about killing Indians than about redressing the grievances of the poor. But he became a symbol of mass resentment against the Virginia establishment, and was elected in the spring of 1676 to the House of Burgesses. When he insisted on organizing armed detachments to fight the Indians outside control, Berkeley proclaimed him a rebel and had him captured, whereupon 2,000 Virginians marched to Jamestown to support him. Berkeley let Bacon go and returned for an apology, but Bacon went off, gathered his militia, and began raiding the Indians. Bacon's Declaration of the People of July July 1676 shows a mixture of populist resentment against the rich and frontier's hatred of the Indian. It indicated that Berkeley administration for unjust taxes, for putting favorites in high positions, for monopolizing the beaver trade, and for not protecting the Western farmers from the Indians. Then Bacon went out to attack the friendly Pamunkey Indians. Then Bacon went out to attack the friendly Pamunkey Indians, killing 8, taking others prisoner, plundering their possessions. There is evidence that the rank and file of both Bacon's rebel army and Berkeley's official army were not as enthusiastic as their leaders. There was mass desertions on both sides, according to Washburn. In the fall, Bacon, aged 29, fell sick and died because of, as the contemporary put it, swarms of vermin that bred in his body. A minister, apparently not a sympathizer, wrote this epitaph. Bacon is dead. I am sorry at my heart. That lice and flux should not take that hangman's part. Oh, shit. Damn, that's quite the diss. The rebellion didn't last long after that. A ship armed with 30 guns cruised the York River, became the base for securing order, and its captain, Thomas Grantham, used force and deception to disarm the last rebel forces. Coming upon the chief garrison of the rebel, he found 400 armed Englishmen and Africans, a mixture of freemen, servants, and slaves. He promised to pardon everyone, to give freedom to slaves and servants, whereupon they surrendered their arms and dispersed, all except for 80 Africans and 20 English who insisted on keeping their arms. Grantham promised to take them to a garrison down by the river. Hold on. Dang, that did mess me up, I'm gonna be honest. It's a wind, okay. It's a wind. Hold on, okay, hold on. Okay, hold on. Okay, my fault. I lost a page, my fault. Hold on, let me get back to this page. It's so windy, that's the problem. It's so windy. Okay. Here we are. Thomas Grantham used force and deception to disarm the last rebel forces. Coming upon, okay. He promised to. Okay. The remaining garrisons were overcome one by one. 23 rebel leaders were hanged. It was a chain of complex oppression in Virginia. The Indians were plundered by white frontiersmen who were taxed and controlled by the Jamestown elite, and the whole colony was being exploited by England, which being bought the colonists tobacco at prices it dictated, and made £100,000 a year for the king. Berkeley himself, returning to England years earlier to protest the English Navigation Acts, which gave English merchants a monopoly of the colonial trade, had said, "We cannot but resent that 40,000 people should be impoverished to enrich little more than 40 merchants, who, being the only buyers of our tobacco, give us what they please for it. And after it is here, sell it how they please, and indeed have 40,000 servants in us at cheaper rates than any other man had slaves." For the testimony of the governor himself, hold on, let me open this one. From the testimony of the governor himself, the rebellion against him had the overwhelming support of the Virginia population. A member of his council reported that the deflection the defection was almost general, and laid it to the lewd dispositions of some persons of desperate fortunes, who had the vain hopes of taking the country wholly out of His Majesty's hands into their own. Another member of the governor's council, Richard Lee, noted that Bacon's rebellion had started over Indian policy, but the zealous inclination of multitude to support Bacon was due, he said, to the hopes of leveling. Leveling meant equalizing the wealth. Leveling was to behind countless acts of poor whites against the rich in all of the English colonies in the century and a half before the Revolution. The servants who joined Bacon's rebellion were part of a large underclass of miserably poor whites who came to North American colonies from European cities whose governments were anxious to be rid of them. In England, the development of commerce and capitalism In England, the development of commerce and capitalism in the 1500s and the 1600s, the closing of land for the production of the wool, filled the cities with vagrant poor, and from the reign of Elizabeth on, laws were passed to punish, imprison them in workhouses, or exile them. The Elizabethan definitions of rogues and vagabonds included all persons calling themselves scholars, going about begging, all seafaring men pretending losses of their ships or goods on the sea, going about the country begging, all idle persons going about in any country either begging or using subtile craft or unlawful games, common players of interludes and minstrels wandering about, all wandering persons and common laborers being persons able in body, using loitering and refusing to work for such reasonable wage as is taxed or commonly given. Such persons found begging could be stripped to the waist and whipped bloody, could be sent out of the city, sent to workhouses, or transported out of the country. In the 1600s and 1700s, by forced exile, by lures, promises, and lies, by kidnapping, by their urgent need to escape the living conditions of the home country, poor people wanting to go to America became commodities of profit for merchants, traders, ship captains, and eventually their masters in America. Abbott Smith, in his study of indentured servitude, his book, Colonists in Bondage, writes, from the complex pattern of forces producing immigration to the American colonies, one stands out clearly as most powerful in causing the movement of servants. This was the pecuniary profit to be made by shipping from them. After signing the indenture, in which the immigrants agreed to pay their cost of passage by working for a master for 5 to 7 years, they were often imprisoned until the ship sailed, to make sure they did not run away. Okay. In the year 1619, the Virginia Assembly of House of Burgesses, born that year as the first representative assembly in America. It was also the year of the first importation of black slaves, provided for the recording and the enforcing of contracts between servants and masters. As in any contrast between unequal powers, the parties appeared on paper as equals, but enforcement was easier for master than for servant. The voyage to America lasted 8, 10, or 12 weeks, and the servants were packed into ships with the same fanatic concern for profits that marked the slave ships. If the weather was bad and the ship took too long, they ran out of food. The sloop Seaflower, leaving Belfast in 1741, was at sea 16 weeks. And when it arrived in Boston, 46 of its 106 passengers were dead of starvation, 6 of them eaten by the survivors. On another trip, 32 children died of hunger, and diseases were thrown into the ocean. Gottlieb Middlesberg, a musician traveling from Germany to America around 1750, wrote about his voyage. During the journey, the ship is full of pitiful signs of distress. Smells, fumes, horrors, vomiting, various kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headaches, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and similar afflictions, all of them caused by the aged and high salted state of the food, especially of the meat, as well as by the very bad and filthy water. And to all that sort of food, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, fear, misery, vexation, and lamentation, as well as other troubles, on board our ship on a day on which we had a great storm. A woman is about to give birth and unable to deliver under these circumstances was pushed through one of the portholes into the sea. Indentured servants were brought and sold like slaves. An announcement in the Virginia Gazette, March 28, 1777, read, "Just arrived at Leestown, the ship Josiah, with about 100 healthy servants, men, women, and boys. The sails were commenced on Tuesday, the 2nd of April." Against the rosy accounts of better living standards in the Americas, one must place many others, like other immigrants' letters from America. Whoever is well off in Europe better remain there. Here is misery and distress, same as everywhere, and for certain persons and conditions, incomparably more better than in Europe. Beatings and whippings were common. Servant women were raped. One observer testified, "I have seen an overseer beat a slave with a cane about the head till the blood was followed. For a fault that is not worth the speaking of." The Maryland court records showed many servant suicides. In 1671, Governor Berkeley of Virginia reported that in previous years, 4 or 5 servants died of a disease after their arrival. 4 or 5 servants, that is. Many were poor children, gathered up by hundreds on the street of English cities and sent to Virginia to work. The master tried to control completely the sexual lives of their servants. It was in his economic interest to keep women servants from marrying or having sexual relations, because childbearing would interfere with work. Benjamin Franklin, writing as Poor Richard in 1736, gave advice to his readers. Let thy maidservant be faithful, strong, and homely. Servants could not marry without permission, could be separated from their families, could be whipped from various offenses. Pennsylvania law in the 17th century said that marriage of servants without the consent of the masters shall be proceeded against as for the adultery or fornication, and the child to be reputed as bastards. Although colonial laws existed to stop excesses against servants, they were not very well enforced. We learn from Richard Morris's comprehensive study of early court records in government and labor in early America. Servants did not participate in juries. Masters did. And propertyless servants did not vote. In 1666, it's a bad year, New England court accused a couple of the death of a servant after the mistress had cut off the servant's toes. The jury voted acquittal. In Virginia, in the 1660s, a master was convicted of raping 2 women servants. He was also known to beat his own wife and children. He had whipped and chained another servant until he died. The master was berated by the court, but specifically cleared on the rape charge, despite overwhelming evidence. Sometimes servants organized rebellions, but one did not find on the mainland the kind of large-scale conspiracies of servants that existed, for instance, on Barbados in the West Indies. Abbott Smith suggests that this was because there was more chance of success on a small island. I can see that. However, in York County, Virginia, in 1661, a servant named Isaac Friend proposed to another, after much dissatisfaction with the food, that they get a matter of 40 of them together and get guns, and he'd be for liberty and free from bondage, and that there would enough come to them, and they would go through the country and kill those that made any opposition, and that they would either be free or die for it. The scheme was never carried out. But 2 years later, in Gloucester County, servants again planned a general uprising. Hold on, let me see where we're at in this chapter. Okay. Let's see. The scheme was never carried out, but 2 years later in Gloucester County, servants again planned for a general uprising. One of them gave the plot away, and 4 were executed. The informer was given his freedom and 5,000 pounds of tobacco. Despite the rarity of servants' rebellions, the threat was always there, and masters were fearful. Finding their situation intolerable and rebellion impractical, in an increasingly organized society, servants reacted in individual ways. The files of the county courts in New England show that one servant struck at his master with a pitchfork. An apprentice servant was accused of laying violent hands upon his master and throwing him down twice, and beaching blood of him, and threatening to break his neck, running at his face with a chair. One maidservant was brought into court for being bad, unruly, sullen, careless, destructive, and disobedient. After the participation of servants in Bacon's rebellion, the Virginia legislature passed laws to punish servants who rebelled. The preamble to the act said, "Whereas many evil disposed servants in those late times of horrid rebellion, taking advantage of the looseness and liberty of the time, did depart from their service and follow the rebels in rebellion, wholly neglecting their master's employment, whereby the said masters have suffered great damage and injury. 2 companies of English soldiers remained in Virginia to guard against future trouble, and their presence was defended in a report to the Lords of Trade and Plantation, saying, Virginia is at present poor and more populous than ever. There is great apprehension of a rising among the servants, owing to their great necessities and want of clothes. They may plunder the storehouses and ships. Escape was easier than rebellion. Numerous instances of mass desertions by white servants took place in the southern colonies, reports Richard Morris, on the basis of an inspection of colonial newspapers in the 1700s. The atmosphere of the 17th century Virginia, he says, was charged with plots and rumors of combinations of servants, combinations of servants to run away. The Maryland court records show in the 1650s a conspiracy of a dozen slaves to seize a boat and to resist with arms if intercepted. They were captured and whipped. The mechanisms of control was formidable. Strangers had to show passports or certifications to prove they were free men. Agreements among the colonies provided for the extradition of fugitive servants. These became the basis of the clause in the U.S. Constitution that persons held to service or labor in one state, escaping into another, shall be delivered upon. Sometimes servants went on strikes. One Maryland master complained to the provincial court in 1663 that his servants did peremptoriously and positively refuse to go and do their labor. The servants responded that they were only fed beans and bread, and that they were so weak we are not able to perform the employments he puts us up upon. They were given 30 lashes by the court. 30 lashes. More than half the colonists who came to the North American shores in the colonial period came as servants. They were mostly English in the 17th century, Irish and German in the 18th century. More and more slaves replaced them as they ran away to freedom or finished their time, but as late as 1755, white servants made up 10% of the populations of Maryland. What happened to these servants after they became free? There are cheerful accounts in which they rise to prosperity, becoming landowners and important figures. But Abbott Smith, after a careful study, concludes that colonial society was not democratic and certainly not egalitarian. It was dominated by men who had money enough to make others work for them. And few of these men were descended from indentured servants, and practically none had themselves been of this class. After we make our way through Abbott Smith's disdain for the servants, as men and women who were dirty and lazy, rough, ignorant, lewd, and often criminal, who thieved and wandered, had bastard children, and corrupted society with loathsome diseases, we found that about 1 in 10 was sound and solid, and who would, if fortunate, survive his seasoning, work out his time, take up land, and wax decently prosperous. Perhaps another 1 in 10 would become an artisan or an overseer. The rest, 80%, who were certainly shiftless, hopeless, ruined individuals either died during their servitude, returned to England after it was over, or became poor whites. Smith's conclusion is supported by a more recent study of servants in the 17th century Maryland, where it was found that the first batches of servants became landowners and politically active in the colony. My fault. Politically active in the county, but the second half of the century, more than half the servants, even after 10 years of freedom, remained landless. Servants became tenants, providing cheap labor for the large planters both during and after their servitude. It seems quite clear that class lines hardened through the colonial period. The distinction between rich and poor became sharper. By 1700, there were 50 rich families in Virginia, with wealth equivalent to £50,000, a huge sum those days, who lived off of the labor of black slaves and white servants. Owned the plantations, sat on the governor's council, served as local magistrates. In Maryland, the settlers were ruled by a proprietor whose right of total control over the colony had been granted by the English king. Between 1650 and 1689, there were 5 revolts against the proprietor. In the Carolinas, the fundamental constitutions were written in the 1600s by John Locke, who was often considered the philosophical father of the founding fathers in the American system. Locke's constitution set up a feudal type of aristocracy in which 8 barons would own 40% of the colony's land, and only a baron could be governor. When the Crown took direct control of North Carolina after a rebellion against the land arrangements, rich speculators seized 500,000 acres for themselves, monopolizing the good farming land near the coast. Poor people, desperate for land, squatted on bits of farmland and fought all through the pre-revolutionary period against the landlord's attempts to collect rent. Carl Breidenbau's study of colonial cities in the wilderness, reveals a clear-cut class system. He finds the leaders of early Boston were gentlemen of considerable wealth who, in association with the clergy, eagerly sought to preserve in America the social arrangements of the mother country. By means of their control of trade and commerce, by their own political domination of the inhabitants, through church and town meeting, and by careful marriage alliances among themselves, members of this little oligarchy laid the foundation of an aristocratic class in 17th century Boston. At the very start of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, the governor, John Winthrop, had declared the philosophy of the rulers: in all times, sometimes must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. Rich merchants erected mansions. Persons of quality traveled in coaches or sedan chairs, had their portraits painted, wore periwigs, and filled themselves with rich food and Mandaria. A petition came from town of Deersfield in 1678 to the Massachusetts General Court. You may be pleased to know that the very principle and best of the land, the best for soil, the best for situation, as laying in ye center and middle of the town. As to the quantity, near half belongs unto 8 or 9 proprietors. sound like urban equity is really what this makes me think of. But hold on. We're going to end this live as we prepare for this body camera meeting tonight. So, day 383, A People's History of the United States, Chapter 3, Part 1.